or biomedical engineering, but to say we just want more joint research, and that was our way to fund this initiative and move it forward. So with that, was my hopefully overview. Open to any questions you may have.
Do you have anything to say about oysters?
Oysters? Who knew oysters were so?
I mean, it's just such a weird thing, right?
It is a very oysters are a good example of one bill that will shut down the Senate of Maryland.
Over the tiniest thing, right?
Because you have watermen on the eastern shore, and you have the scientists who want to protect the Chesapeake Bay, and neither of the two shall meet. They've tried. There have been bills forcing people around the table. Inevitably, it ends in yelling and one party walking away. There was another bill this year that shut down the Senate that was trying to re-engage that process that would have forced all the parties to the table about these oyster sanctuaries where watermen would not be able to fish the oysters. It did pass, but we don't know. We think it'll probably get vetoed by the governor because the watermen are very strong in the Republican base. Yeah.
So you've been mentioning your constituents and stuff like that. So when you say going for advocating for something that would affect the state as a whole, would a strategy be to try to find which district matters to you most? How many do you need to have? If it only affects one district but it's a lot, does that person produce it and you have to hope that person has enough clout within the rest of your colleagues to get it through, or are there kind of ways to equal that out?
So I'm going to be a little bit crass. It comes down to the incentives, the individual legislators' incentives, which at the end of the day is voters. And so it could affect my district, but if no voters are bringing it to my attention, it's something I will listen to and pay attention to. And I'm trying to be a bit crude on this because to make the point, I think my colleagues are very intentional and thoughtful and try to do the best that they can. But with 1,800 issues at one time, you just have to kind of piecemeal. So if 5 constituents were to come to my office on a single issue, I will listen to what.
Even if it's happening maybe in another district?
Yes.
Okay.
If it's totally separate. I mean, oysters is a good example where that's really the Eastern Shore, but I have a lot of passionate environmentalists who will come in and are consistently in my ear about the importance of these things. And so, and they're available all the time. They come out to town halls. I know them. And so it could be somewhere way over here, but they're my constituents, and I need to make sure that I'm representing their interests.
That's the whole point of it, I guess.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Cool.
Yeah. Now there is always the big debate, and legislators debate this internally. Am I elected for who I am and the opinions and thoughts that I have, and so the voters trust me to make decisions based on the values that I espouse in the campaign, and should I use that as a mechanism? Or am I a conduit for my constituents based on the numbers of people that engage? My values may be different than the number of my constituents, and that conflict happens all the time. And there's no real tried and true answer, but it depends on how close you are to an election.
So I'm in medicine now, but my background was in environmental health and business or some science background, just in specifically risk assessment and environmental racism, such as lead and water.
Yep.
And so I was just sort of wondering how any policies that any bills that may come on at your level and local level conflicts, or with the federal level, to say you wanted to regulate more, like we want to lower parts of the billion of lead, or we want less particles in the air, or something like that. And does the EPA, is that like a conflict?
So I can guarantee you that's what the industry will say. So, and has said on lead issues is that, well, this is regulated by the either Clean Air Act or Clean Water, and industry will often point to say, nope, you're preempted by the federal level, right? So that industry will always want to have the least number of places to defend a stand. So if they can get something passed at the federal level, then they can preempt state action. You know, I think on the environmental issues, there's lots of inventive ways that some environmental lawyers have come up with trying to get standing and to sort of adjust the interpretation, but a lot of the environmental stuff is delegated for enforcement to the states. So clean air, clean water, MDE, Maryland Department of the Environment, is the one that actually does the enforcement. And so there's a little bit more room to play at a state level. There are issues, like right now we're dealing with an issue around tobacco regulation. And the city of Baltimore cannot regulate tobacco issues because there is a state finance, out of the finance business article, the trademarks, the regulation of distribution of tobacco is a state law. And so there have been lawsuits when local jurisdictions have said, you know, this zoning issue increases the likelihood that children will smoke. It is preempted by state law, and there's a consistent fight. So the preemption issue is always relevant when it's industry versus public advocacy often. But there's always ways to kind of think creatively, legislatively to make it work. Most of the time.
Yeah, thank you.
Talking about the environmental issues, because right now I'm working on a project for my MBA purposes. It's winding up with that, and we are trying to look at the environment, air pollution issues in Europe. So comparatively, when we are trying to assess what's happening here, although the study does not involve what's happening in the nation, it's about 2 countries in the European zone. They are far more better in terms of their policy and stringency. And you would see that in America, for us, we consider the standard for the particulate matter, which is 10 microns, which is the larger particulate matter, is 150 micrometers annual limit, versus the European zone, which has an annual limit of 25. So that's, and you see a lot much more of diseases occurring. The urbanization, the population increasing, the economy is not doing really well. Why isn't the government still not taking action towards improving the standards that will by itself take into account the entire healthcare system and the ecosystem itself?
That is the problem. You are giving a perfect example of a larger problem that when public health people come to Annapolis, leave horrified. Because again, it goes to facts, data, and studies point very clear out. And when I came to the legislature, I was at the time the youngest ever elected state senator, and sort of came thinking like, I got great data about education. Like I have, this is what we can be doing. These are strategies that have worked in Singapore and in Canada. And then I very quickly, 8 years later, realized this is wonderful. This may start a conversation, but this is what matters. And that's why.
We do have that, because you still see a lot many, you don't have an answer to glioblastoma, you have various new diseases, rare diseases, you have all that there. And we do know that it's because of the environment that we are living in, there are more number of diseases occurring as well.
So that is a true statement that you just play it out in terms of I'm in the middle of session, and my immediate reaction would be, I just don't even know where to start. And so, yes, it's probably a crisis, but I don't know where to start. And unless it's boiled down to something that you can show me somebody, a child in my district that because of this plant, pumped this into the air, and then this child is had, in a case of whatever it may be, it's very hard to relate to it. And so it feels like a big problem that, yes, we should address it. I don't know where to start. And that's where scientists, when they translate their voice into this, are incredibly effective. But it's very uncomfortable for scientists to be in this room.
So related to that, in my day job I work at Loyola University, and I've interacted with the lobbies from Catholic Charities a good bit, and they seem to really understand the left side of this equation. Who would you say in Maryland, related to science, healthcare, environment, which are the groups that are really effective?
Yeah, so Vinnie DeMarco. So there's a book called The DeMarco Factor.
Uh-huh.
Vinnie DeMarco is what sort of they say a white hat lobbyist. So he advocates for, so we just did Tobacco 21, raising the age of tobacco purchases from 18 to 21. And he is incredibly effective at understanding how to translate this formula into this outcome.
Yeah.
And so he's probably the leading one out there of kind of the causes-based lobbying team. But Vinnie DeMarco, everyone in Annapolis knows Vinnie DeMarco and the DeMarco Factor. And he's really, especially healthcare, he's done a lot. Healthcare and guns are the two places where he's spent a lot of guns in terms of restricting access.
But even recognition of a crisis depends on which side you're sitting in.
Yes, yes.
You know, climate change.
Right, well, climate change is a great,
vaccination,
it is a crisis, right? There's no question it's a crisis,
just
and
water.
everyone will say it's a crisis, but then the next question is, what am I going to do about it? Even though we're legislators, we're the ones that are supposed to be doing something about it, right? But it's very challenging. I forgot one important point. The most effective legislators often will focus in one issue area and go very deep in one issue area. And so there are legislators, so for instance, Terry Hill, who represents Howard County, is a plastic surgeon, but she's a doctor. And so when issues come up related to healthcare and sort of regulating doctors and the industry, her voice is, she has the relationships within the chamber that if Terry's saying something, okay, we need to listen, like there's something real here. Clarence Lamb is a senator from Howard County, he's also a doctor, works at Hopkins. If he says something about emergency medicine, I can just default, whatever Clarence says, just tell me how to vote. Because there are so many issues that legislators have to, we have to sort of trust each other. It's like the single most important commodity in Annapolis is trust. And if you sort of delegate, so if IMED, we've had lots of interesting conversations about IMED over the last few years. And if there is somebody that really understands the issue and has dedicated or demonstrated leadership in an issue area, then you want to find who that actor is to be your sort of champion of that cause.
So are you saying more scientists should run for Congress?
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely, yes.
So Bill, how, like, just back of the envelope, just pull something out of your,
Yeah.
what,
That's what I'm best at.
in your experience, what comes first, the crisis or the data?
So,
Just even, on a bill that passes. I'm just very concerned, as is typical science, that you're responding to an anecdote and not to data.
oh,
So,
I'm sorry. It shouldn't be that way, but it is.
I know it is, but
If I want to pass a bill, I am trying to think about how do I create the crisis. So if a crisis doesn't actually
so the
exist-
crisis gets created.
Yes.
It's manufactured.
Yes. That is one of the most effective ways of moving an issue.
And then typically somebody but you guys are a little wise to the anecdote, aren't you? Don't you dig a little deeper on the crisis?
Yes, there has to be something. There has to be something behind it, but we're not going to look at which study you review. We're not going to
You don't have time for that.
check citations, right? No. But the challenge is, and this is a sort of warning that is a good point. If somebody does manufacture the crisis to get action, because again, there are so many issues that we're dealing with. If we deal with something, then we are very loath to take it back up in the near future. Right. So even if the crisis is created around the wrong solution or the wrong initiative, and then next year somebody says, well, that wasn't the right thing, we got to do it. The general reaction is, wait, we took care of that last year. Like that,
We're tired.
It's not the timing. We're done with that. And so timing in the legislative process is very important. And so that's why the crises that are totally manufactured will often get exposed because somebody that really understands it will say, wait a second, no, that's not it. It's amazing. So the interesting thing about the legislative process is that it does actually work. And it's ugly, and it's messy, and it's really slow and frustrating. but it generally, over time, starts to get it right. It's just not built to be quick and really effective and immediate.
So when someone comes to you with an issue, how much of a solution do they need to have in hand already? Say, this is the problem, here's what you should do about it, versus here's the problem. I'm not sure what you should do about it, but I think you can do something, as opposed to solving climate change.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It depends on who the messenger is. So if it's a constituent of mine who's just talking about a problem, I don't feel like they shouldn't offer the, like if it's just somebody that I'm knocking on their door and they say, I've got this big issue with these invasive species trees, right, or something. I don't expect them to have the solution. But if the city's arborist is coming to me and saying, we've got this problem with these invasives, then my immediate reaction is, well, then what, so what? You're the arborist, tell me. So it kind of depends on who the messenger is. The best way to move something, a lot of people will come to me at the beginning of session or the months leading up to session saying, I've got this idea, I want a bill about this, and at this point, sort of in my legislative career, my default is to say no, because I want to focus on just a couple of things and really spend my energy on things that I think are going to have the biggest impact. When I was first elected, I would sort of, oh, that sounds great, I'll do that too, and then everything wouldn't move, you know. So the best advocates sort of do the work ahead of time. They have the legislative language. They hand it to me and they say, we need a bill draft about this. This is what it does. They can give me like a one-pager that explains it quickly. They will pre-write testimony for me that says, you know, here are the highlight points and the talking points, and I'll always sort of take it and put it into my own sort of flavor. But all of it is sort of, they'll line up people to testify, they'll have done a lot of the pre-thinking ahead of time, and so I'm sort of the conduit of the effort as opposed to trying to devise it myself. I get a little bit more engaged in the nitty-gritty of my bills than maybe the average senator does. That's not better or worse, it's just sort of a style. And so either way though, if it's packaged and ready and you have somebody that's sympathetic, the more that is done ahead of time, the better and more likely it'll be somebody will take it on.
So I want to follow up on the question about crisis and relationships. And for example, it's like climate change. There are a couple of, real solutions. Like you mentioned, it's a crisis that needs to be addressed, but you don't know where to start. Say for instance, you have a bunch of scientists who come and tell you that nuclear power is the way to go to reduce carbon emissions, which is being like, they can show you case studies of Sweden and Finland and other countries. But your public might be like very wary of nuclear energy, right? So what do you choose? Do you choose this bill passed by the scientists, like, take it and say like this is going better for the environment? Or would you follow through the emotions and relationships with your constituents and say like, my people don't want this, so I'm going to stay away from it? Like, how do you choose?
That's a good
how
question.
do you pick?
I wish I had a general rule. I would say it is very contextual. And it's funny you bring up nuclear because the other one was hydro. We had the Clean Energy Jobs Act, which this year passed to say that in Maryland by 2030 we would go to 50% of our purchased energy will be from renewable sources. But in our renewable energy portfolio standard, we had hydro is a tier 2, so it doesn't get as much of a credit. Mm-hmm. And there was an effort to move it up into a tier 1. As you can imagine, the solar and wind people don't want anybody else in tier 1. And so at some point there's probably good reasons on both, and you kind of got to go with your gut and you do the best that you can with the information that's there. But inevitably, one golden rule is if my constituents, people that are known voters in my district, are coming to me and making the case, that is more likely to get my attention than somebody from Prince George's County that is eminently qualified but has no relation to anything I do here in the 46th district.
So what are these issues that these one or two things that you're the expert in?
So this year I had one, I mainly focus on public education. I'm very concerned about the state of public education overall and think that we are really losing globally, nationally. Maryland is way underperforming where we should be as one of the richest states and the richest country of the world. And our outcomes are hugely inequitable based on race and class. And so it is something we've tolerated for well too long. And so I think we really need to radically rethink what how we approach public schooling and what it means, what an effective education means. And it's not just 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. It's the education must be broader. So that is where, and so funding and how the budget shows our values is where I spend a lot of my time. The other issue that I spent a lot of time on was availability of guns, because here in the city we have just an unconscionable amount of gun violence. And I found this one loophole about people that loaned guns to prohibited individuals, and in 2006 there was this court case that said that a loan is not a transfer, and so if you loaned it, you don't have to get a background check. And that has existed since 2006, and so there are not really any prosecutions about illegally supplying a gun, because oftentimes the people that are handing them over know this and will say, I just loaned it, I didn't sell it. And so we were able to close that loophole this year. So I try to pick things that I know are achievable, and then I think, I did end up having, I think, 14 bills this year, and I think I passed 10, but some of them are little tiny things that are very city specific.
As a
Yeah.
constituent of yours,
Yeah.
you do the other 9 months of the year.
So I work at the Hopkins School for the School of Education. So that's my official job for 9 months of the year on that, and 3 months a year on the other. But the challenge is that the General Assembly, although it stops officially and is a part-time legislature, it never actually stops. So during the working hours, I'm at the Hopkins School of Education. At night, I'm at community groups, and then like next Wednesday, we have to go back in session for 1 day to elect a new speaker. And that's a really extraordinary circumstance, but I'm often back in Annapolis 3 or 4 times a month for interim committee hearings, or we have task forces and commissions, and that's when, that's a really important point that I forgot. Commissions and task forces are where the data actually can really move things. So everything I talked about was during the legislative session. A lot of times, things that are complex and have studies can be incorporated, and the facts can be more important if there is a task force, a working group, or a commission dedicated to that subject.
I was thinking that really doesn't work for the Oyster Commission.
Well, but that's what the Oyster Commission is, an attempt to try and get to this. Now, sometimes the politics are just so bad that this doesn't work, but in commissions that happen outside of session, oftentimes, they'll call it summer study, or a working group for X, or a commission on Y. That's when presenting facts and data and studies really can have an impact, because there's more time to really think more deeply about one issue. So, if let's say you have a piece of legislation, it gets crushed in the legislature, doesn't move anywhere. A backfill way to do it is to say, all right, let's take this bill and turn it into a study, or turn it into a commission. We pass the study, require a report in December of that same year. You spend 3 or 4 months in a working group with the right people around the table, and the bill comes back, and you can come the next time in the legislature to say, well, this bill started as something, we did a year-long working group on it, and so this is the recommendation of the stakeholders, and that has a much higher likelihood of moving.
Just had a quick question about, speaking of crises, what are the regulations in Maryland for measles vaccinations? Do we have a lot of exemptions?
Well, this is obviously in the news, and we have the religious exemption, which is the largest and most utilized. Ours are pretty, because of Hopkins and University of Maryland, we do actually incorporate more kind of evidence-based than I would say most legislatures do. I've been very surprised at this measles issue, because I thought that we had pretty stringent vaccination requirements. But it's coming, I saw an email chain happening where somebody was asking our Department of Legislative Services to do an analysis. So I'm not entirely sure, but something's not working.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, so I get that people are busy and that they have, there's so many bills, and then they have this incentive to respond to their constituents. But if somebody does, want to understand an issue, like, maybe a state senator who told me that, biomass was great, and he didn't understand what he was talking about, and I explained to him that burning old wood is toxic and not environmentally friendly. Is there any process for scientific literacy for people such as yourself to to really understand these efforts? You know, something from the scientists to translate it to the policymakers.
So for me, at the state level, there's an organization called NCSL, National Council of State Legislatures, and they have expert staff, and we will rely on these sort of associations and groups. NCSL is sort of a nonpartisan, nonprofit, sort of seen as kind of a trusted broker. And so those organizations will sponsor policy-specific workshops and gatherings. And so legislators who are interested will attend those. That's probably the best way.
So some of these nonprofit organizations that might be web-based or something, okay.
Yeah, and they'll
not
do,
biased.
like, I'm a part of this group called New Deal Leaders, and so it's young, progressive elected officials across the country, and they'll pick subjects that we sort of vote are important. So we got a lot on the opioid crisis recently, because that across the country is really buzzing. And all of us are looking for solutions, but don't really know exactly what's best. And I'm sure FACIT probably tries to do some of these with legislative staffers too, and if not the Congress people themselves, their staff.
So if they can have staffers that do it, yeah.
Yeah. Staff, I mean, there's nothing more important than elected official staff members.
Yeah.
They are the lifeblood of information.
But that also goes back to relationships that
Exactly.
again, right? Because
Exactly.
if you don't know the SME, the subject matter expert to call, then you don't necessarily have the information that you need. And it doesn't sound like, you know, the other organization that you talked about, that holds the workshop and the gatherings,
Yep.
is quite as intensive as, like, say, the Congressional Research Service.
Well, NCSL is, and they will rely, I mean, NCSL is like a very unique organization that all 50 states participate as a part of. So it's a pretty robust, and they have a lot of relationships, but that's the only one out there that is of that caliber. There are then some more specific, subject area specific ones, but we have a Department of Legislative Services that is on legislative staff, and Maryland has one of the best systems in the country of nonpartisan legislative staff that's both on, they do policy research and they do sort of legislative legal research. So all of us have access to all of the Department of Legislative Services. So DLS provides a lot of information. It's similar to congressional research. CRS. Thank you.
Tom, if you haven't yet, we're giving these guys a couple of posters.